around the release of the unemployment figures today, and South Africa, surely one of the countries that has the highest unemployment rates in the world. This means that almost half of the country's population are out of work. Now, government has struggled to contain this negative trend with little economic growth in the past 10 years. Statistics South Africa will today release these latest figures, which will give a sense of whether any of the interventions that are being made are actually working. Well, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, that's COSATU for short, has been calling on government to take drastic steps to avoid a deepening unemployment crisis. Joining us now for this conversation is the Federation's Matthew Parks. He talks to us from Cape Town. Mr. Parks, thank you very much for your time. Talk us through, almost in bullet point form, if you can, what these interventions that you have been calling on government to implement, what they are exactly.
Sure, no, good morning. Look, I expect, and one doesn't want to be a pessimist, but we're expecting the results this afternoon not to be good, because I think we've had a huge amount of load shedding. We've seen transit and metro rail really struggling. We've seen the international oil price and the local fuel price skyrocketing because of the war in Ukraine. And of course, that's going to make it much more difficult for workers to pay their debts, for companies to hire workers. So we expect more bad news, sadly, this afternoon. I think for us, the critical intervention which we can control as a country, because we don't control the war in Ukraine, that's beyond our power. Well, one is to fix Eskom, to accelerate the implementation of Eskom's social compact, and in particular, to give debt relief to Eskom so it can focus on maintenance and generation, because that's going to boost the entire economy, all companies. We need to save and rebuild Transnet, because that's critical to saving and creating thousands of jobs in the mining and manufacturing and agricultural sectors. Similarly, we need to do likewise with Metro Rail, because that's key to getting 10 million workers and commuters in our cities to work on time. That boosts economic productivity. We also need to have a hard look and honest discussion about what can we do to rebuild local government, in particular basic services, because you've seen companies like Clover closing the plants in Lichtenberg and Frankfurt because of a lack of basic services. I think we also need to see much more work, and there has been some green shoots which we must acknowledge in the past few weeks around tackling corruption, because that will send a positive message to South Africans, to investors, local and foreign, that the money will be well spent in this country. So I think for us, those are the critical things, and of course, we need to look at how can we mobilize stimulus, not just from the state, but also from the banks and the private sector too, because the government itself will always have limited funds available. Yeah. I think for us, those are the critical kind of intervention points, and those are maybe lastly, probably, is around the fuel price. That has a huge impact upon workers and commuters, upon companies, the economy. It will suppress demand. So we do hope the ministers of finance and mineral and energy will extend the kind of temporary relief they had given in April and come with a much more affordable fuel price regime, because the current one is just suffocating the economy.
Yeah, and it's on that last point I want to pick up on, Matthew Parks, and that talks directly to the rising cost of living for the people of this country, and indeed the working class which you organize. Just how drastic a step must the finance minister, alongside his energy colleague, do to try and control this oil price, if we have any control at all, given the geopolitical matters that you've touched on earlier?
Sure. And look, as an oil importing country, we have our hands are somewhat tied, but we do have some power on the fuel price regime, because a third of that goes to taxes, and there is some space there. So if the fuel price is going to head towards 25 Rand a litre soon, that means there's about 8 Rand a litre we could play with. It's not an easy choice, because that is revenue for the state, and if you reduce state taxes, it creates a hole in one part that you need to see where can you cut expenditure, where can you find additional revenue to cover that shortfall and so forth. But there needs to be something done, because if we're going to see a fuel price regime hike of about 3 Rand or even 4 Rand a litre from tomorrow, it's going to devastate the economy. It's going to make it very difficult for workers who already spend about a quarter to a third of their income getting to work. It's going to force the agricultural sector to push up food prices. It's going to make it even difficult for Eskom, which often uses diesel for load shedding purposes. So the government needs to do something. We had welcomed the 2-month reprieve. We can't now go back to where we were before. But there are other things we can do around the fuel price. So there's a road accident fund bill and RAPS bill which were rejected by Parliament. Those are going to help to set the road accident fund on a sustainable trajectory. They need to be retabled at Parliament. We need to deal with the real corruption, mismanaging the road accident fund and the profiteering there, because there's a liability of 400 billion rand, and it's critical probably for the fuel price, because a significant chunk of the fuel price goes to subsidize the RAF, the fuel levy.
Yeah.
We need to fix Metro Rail to get workers out of cars into trains, invest in public transport. There are longer term things we need to do, like investing in electric vehicles and so forth. But I think for the short term, let's extend the relief on the fuel price. Let's get the RAF bill to Parliament. Let's fix Metro Rail, because those we can control.
Yeah. Perhaps, Matthew, one of the key aspects that people are going to be focusing their attention on, yes, overall, the unemployment figure, the official unemployment figure, which now stands at 35.3%. The figures around the unemployment of women and in particular the youth of this country. I mean, the president has said as much, that young people, the army of young people who remain unemployed in this country is what keeps him up at night. And so having said that, we heard him announce yesterday that he is going to be announcing a BEE advisory council. And my understanding is that you have slammed that as COSATU to say it's much ado about nothing. Explain that to us.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think so. We take unemployment stats as being about 46%. If we take the expanded definition of anybody who could work who can't find work. And you're right. I mean, the unemployment rate for young people is scary, 75%. You cannot sustain a society with that kind of unemployment rate. It's a ticking time bomb, as we saw the violence in KZN and Gauteng a year ago. It should keep all of us up at night, not just the president, but every single one of us, and especially the private sector. We need to do much more. We need to really overhaul our skills regime, because it's unbelievable that many companies struggle to find certain skilled workers, yet we have an army of unemployed workers. It's also unbelievable that many companies choose to circumvent our labor laws and to hire vulnerable, undocumented migrant workers to avoid paying minimum wage, etc. And again, we have an army of unemployed young people. Look, we welcome the BE presidential advisory panel, and organized labor will be there. But I think for us, it's about, will government listen to these advisory panels? Will government implement the recommendations? And of course, I think we do support the principles of triple BE. We cannot not support it, given that South Africa, as the World Bank said recently, remains the most unequal society in the world. We still have the scars of apartheid across our landscape. But we want to see BE not being abused by the usual well-off billionaires. We don't want to see it be abused by people who use it to front and then simply bring in illegal imports from overseas, from Asia, etc. So we really want to see a much more progressive understanding of BE, which speaks to the township economy, to young people. It speaks to supporting local procurement, and it speaks to dealing with a very unequal society, of giving opportunities to people who have never been empowered, and not the usual kind of entrepreneurs, not the relatives of politicians and so forth. So it's a balancing act. We have to ask the hard questions, and we have to hold government account where it fails. And equally, we have to shine some spotlight on the private sector, where often we find people abuse our progressive laws simply to enrich a few, or to enrich the politically connected elite.
Yeah, perhaps it is appropriate, Matthew Parks, to end this conversation on a rather controversial note. While we talk about unemployment figures that we expect today to increase, in your words, which means that the unemployment situation in the country is going to be much worse than what we saw the previous year, there is an ongoing strike by Sibanye steel workers, and the president was at the forefront of that on the 1st of May, being asked by the workers to intervene. Those workers have now decided to go and camp outside the union buildings, which is where he works, the president. Who's at fault here for prolonging this strike, and how should it, what is going to be done to help put an end to it so that these workers retain their jobs?
Sure. Look, workers go on strike as an act of last resort when employers refuse to engage with them or to engage meaningfully on them. It's not an easy choice for workers or for unions because the rule of no work, no pay normally applies. I mean, these workers are losing salaries every day. So we do want to see the strike being resolved as soon as possible and these workers being able to go back to work. It's quite simple. Who's at fault? It's the management of the company. All these workers are asking for is a 1,000 rand increase a month. I think the gap between what management offered them and what workers had asked for was about 150 rand. Surely the company, which is bleeding billions of rands, can afford to pay an additional 150 rand a month. As you have said earlier, that workers are being hit by fuel price increases, food increases, electricity, and municipal hikes. Workers are highly indebted. They want to go back to work, but they've clearly reached a limit at Sibanye. At the same time, you have Sibanye, the CEO, earning in one single year 300 million rand, and they refuse to offer these workers a simple 150 rand increase a month. It's unbelievable. So the real solution is for the company simply to engage with these workers in good faith. We are pleased that since the May Day event in Rustenburg, the president did appoint the Minister of Mineral Resources, Gwede to help move the engagements along. There has been some engagements at the CCMA. We're hoping that we can find each other soon. But for us, the bottom line is that workers deserve these increases. They deserve a right to survive, to have a living wage, to take care of their families. And the company can afford it. This is a company which paid billions of rands to the shareholders. And yet, when it comes to these workers who actually produce the wealth, they then want to plead poverty.
Matthew, very, very briefly, I'm out of time. I'm already in trouble as it is. Do you think that the Mineral Resources Minister, Gwede should make good on his promise to withdraw the mining license from Sibanye?
Look, any company which doesn't utilize their mining licenses, they should be spanked by government. We have seen many retrenchments in the mining sector. Many companies are willing to mine. This is a critical sector of the economy to build the economy. So if any company, be it Sibanye or whomever, doesn't want to use the rights, the department is empowered by law to hold them accountable. And they should be held accountable in that regard. That's the conditions of the mining rights.
Matthew Parks is COSATU's parliamentary coordinator. Thank you very much for your time.